With Gus, we are going to discuss seabed, which is the seabed strategy for the energy transition, and especially based in the UK. But first, I mean, many of us, of you, if you don't follow like energy transition markets or news every day, you will be surprised to why someone from the Crown State is talking in an energy transition summit. So let me start asking you exactly what like why is the Crown State so involved with energy and how?
Brilliant, thanks, Nicholas. It's always a good reason to sit up here to have to first justify why you get a seat. But just for those who don't know us, so the Crown Estate, we are essentially a company for the country. So we operate independently and commercially, but all of our money goes back to the nation's treasury, to HMT. We have a broad portfolio of about £16 billion valued assets across the country. That includes everything from the heart of London, Regent Street, through to being one of the nation's largest rural landowners. But also then we own the seabed around England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and much of the coastline, which is the patch that I run. And from all of that, we put at our purpose, and this is what we might come on to talk a bit about, is how do we drive net zero for what we do as a company that's driving the nation's ambitions? How do we at the same time try to restore biodiversity across our estates as a whole? And at the same time, how do we help to do everything we can for the national jobs economic transition as well, and trying to achieve those three things?
Perfect. Okay, so my first question for you will be after this one. Will be like, how do you see the seabed strategy evolving, and how do you see? I mean, we all think offshore wind is coming more and more robust, especially in the UK. So, how are you preparing for that? Or first, like, do you agree that we will have like more offshore wind in the coast?
So, will we have more offshore wind? Yes, that's the simple one. Well, yes, we need. But just to take a step back, so probably everyone in this room has heard of the energy trilemma, and we've kind of been thinking about that. Lots of discussion in different ways has been about cost, or has been about carbon, or has been about security. All of those quite negative things in a way. So what I'm trying to get us to think about is how do we plan forward in a different way? I call it the energy hat trick in terms of sports analogy, of how can we present a future where we actually see the transition about a nature and a natural environment transition, about a green energy transition, at the same time giving hope to communities right across the country in terms of a job transition. So now we have a lot of things in the way of that. We have a lot of opportunities as well. If we look at where we are just on one of those, how do we drive green energy? We know that actually things are getting harder potentially than easier. So offshore wind, the time from a lease, when developers get a lease from us, so a patch of seabed from us, it's taking longer to take the FID than it did in the past. The seabed is becoming more complex and more crowded, whether that's across the need for energy, offshore wind. We see that growing, possibly up to about tenfold across our seabed up to 2050. But at the same time, thinking about carbon capture, thinking about hydrogen, thinking about integrated energy. At the same time, thinking about other seabed users, thinking about cables and data, which power about 90% of the global traffic in terms of data, and as we see that expanding out. So we have on one side a huge growth in our seabed as what I see as the nation's most important asset for that hat trick. The other side, though, we see a world where nature is in decline. The State of Nature report last year highlighted that the UK has one of the most deteriorated natural environments on the planet, which makes me sad to even say those words out loud. We know, for example, that seagrass is 35 times faster at capturing carbon than the tropical rainforest. Yet in just taking the UK's waters, we've seen about a 40% decline in our seagrass since the 1980s. And then if you take we've talked a bit in this room today about taking the population with you, and it's actually quite fitting. I don't know if anyone listened to today's programme this morning. They were talking about it's 40 years today since the start of the miners' strike. How do we actually take the population with us? Well, that's because there is an opportunity to create new jobs, new investment, new skills right across the country as well. So that comes together in terms of what we're trying to do, which is to how do we plan what we call a delivery route map with our core partners. We've heard from the grid, National Grid today, ESO, the system operator, to plan how do you fit all of these things in, how do you create a more future and certain pipeline, and crucially, how do we de-risk developments as we go forward.
Perfect. And what you mentioned about the environment and how it's being degraded into in the North Sea makes me want to cry a little bit. But also, let's talk about fishing industry. And we know in the UK the fishing industry is a powerful one. It has big lobby, power of lobby. How are you working with them in terms to and also in many countries they complain about offshore wind developments. So how are you dealing with them?
So the thing that the Crown Estate has as a core player across the seabed development side, we're not responsible for fishing, I should say, or fishing rights rather, but we are responsible for energies across the seabed, apart from oil and gas. It gets a complicated mix but, in terms of how things are set up. But we are doing the system planning, and that's the crucial thing to convey a bit here is if we look at fishing, but also if we look at environment, part of what's happened to date has been, just take offshore wind, every project having to solve every issue in its own isolation. How do you mitigate the environmental impact of a wind farm? How do you, if you're a fisher, if you go out with fishing fleets, they see each wind farm, each one as another threat, another zone that's potentially impacted from fishing. And the same across other sectors as well. We even see it across energy as sometimes a sort of a overlap between, say, carbon capture sites and offshore wind. As well, we see it about grid planning offshore, and we see it with data cables. All of these things can have project by project conflicts. So the switches that we actually need to see our sea space, but actually our national space as well, as a whole system. And switch it to planning to what we're doing in the Crown Estate to start saying, let's plan from 2050. So I see this as the biggest national regeneration project that we've had probably since World War II. And I spent my life working on big programs and big plans. I've never worked on a program before without a plan. Without a governance structure around it, without a clear sense of the timescales, and without all of those dependencies that you would map out. If any one of us was building a big infrastructure project, would have that all mapped out. A big national regeneration project to powering our country by clean energy, about 50% off the sea space, as we know, and then capturing carbon, potential for hydrogen, as we talked, as I mentioned. If we see that as a system issue, then how do we start to not solve every single wind turbine by wind term having to solve every fishing issue or environmental issue? We're actually starting to map out the future of all of the industries. We've started spatially mapping the whole of the seabed, so giving the seabed almost a postcode of value for different users, down to 1 kilometre squared. So you can start layering on the levelized cost of energy, the environmental benefits, the other users such as fishing, shipping, etc. And start to work out how do you get the whole mix to work for the long term so that different industries can adapt and grow as we go forward. So
we could say that you are moving from a project by project basis towards more a system, kind of like understanding the scope on the seabed. That's good to know. And let me ask you something. Like there is a lot of conversation about the lack of infrastructure for offshore wind and also for CCS, but let's talk about offshore wind. It is closer to us. Like infrastructure in ports, in cables, that you just mentioned them. I know like the Crown Estate is not particularly responsible for many of those infrastructure, but are you working on like helping that infrastructure come to place when it's needed?
Yes, in short, although. So to take a live example, we're working on, at the moment, a tender. So the way we take offshore wind to market is we essentially tender seabed. We work with developers then to develop those wind farms. We have an opportunity to place the UK even further at the lead of the global offshore wind industry, and that's through floating wind. So this is essentially turbines that float on the sea surface, anchored to the floor. They're incredible engineering, by the way. If you walk out here and see the Shard, they are as high as the Shard Tower, floating on a platform about the size of a football pitch. We are currently just launched a process in the Celtic Sea, that's off Wales and southwest England's coast, for about 4.5 gigawatts, but we aim in time that this can turn into a broader potential as well. Now, a few things within that. Firstly this is where we switch the system approach. If you're a port having to do many hundreds of millions of pounds of investment to where we know the need will be there, but it's not going to be there for 5, 6, 7 years, and in our current system, too much uncertainty about will it ever come there, will the projects get consent, will they get planning, is it worth me building now? Our system is set up with essentially a series of baton relays. I won't make my FID until you make yours, and you sign a contract to me, and then you sign a contract to me, and that baton gets passed on. So when you're a wind developer, if there's any in the room here today, you finally say, great, I've now got all of my batons passed on, I'm going to make my decision for which port to use. You turn around and, surprise, surprise, the baton hasn't been passed on to the port, who now have to start their process of investing, consenting, building, and we've missed the opportunity. So we're trying to turn that system on its head. First off is planning, as I said, the whole of the sea space, including with fishing, including with those other uses, to reduce that consenting risk up front. We are conducting surveys so we know what's down there up front as a change of the approach rather than the developer doing it. Again, more certainty that the consent will come, that we know where we're building. We are doing all of the environmental assessments up front rather than down the line, again reducing that uncertainty period. We're also changing the notion of what counts as good in infrastructure development. So for the first time in our history here, for offshore wind, we are putting in that developers must say, as they bid for how they're going to build, what social value they're going to create, what port they're going to use to integrate, what social value in terms of things like apprenticeships that they're going, or skills they're going to create in the region as well, and also what environmental net gain. So all of that preloading up front. Also, we're planning with National Grid ESO, the grid design. So you'll hear a lot about fantastic offshore wind, but it's like having a kettle without a plug. It's no benefit unless you can plug it in. Planning that up front, so by the time developers build, we want them to be doing what developers do brilliantly, which is raise capital, build incredible engineering, and get that quickly to market. So we're de-risking that up front. And finally, as the Crown Estate, we are currently looking at how we put our own capital to use. So we are launching a supply chain fund to help and target and boost the supply chain to reduce that sort of anticipatory investment area. We want to do more. We currently, people who follow UK politics would have seen in the autumn statement, there was a commitment to look at the Crown Estate's powers to allow us to borrow more and allow us to invest even more. I'm going to steal a phrase I heard from someone else today, to do more impatient capital. Impatient because actually we want to get the investments moving faster, but we can take a long-term view of what that value and win is.
Well, that definitely will reduce the uncertainty, erase some red tape, and especially in a technology and an industry that is changing so much. I have read there are so many uncertainty problems associated with the evolving shapes and changing shape of the windmills, and how to deal with larger and larger structures. So it's quite good that you are trying to reduce that uncertainty significantly. Let me ask you a final question, and let's imagine it is 50 years now from today. We will be a bit older, but how you would like to see the seabed structurability? What do you think the Crown Estate should have achieved by then? Yeah,
so 50 years is quite a way, but let's say 2050, because there's some targets around then. But anyway, in the future, 25, 50 years on. So I would like us to be able to see thriving communities right across the whole country, because the divide between offshore and onshore has been broken down. We can see what's happening offshore has a clear benefit, and that's how we get the buy-in as well when we talk about how does the population see the energy transition, actually seeing the benefits it gives for revitalising large parts of the country. I would like to turn to my children. Actually, they will be turning to me probably if I'm 50 years on and helping me out. But I would like to be able to speak to my grandchildren at least about the fact that our seas are thriving again from a natural perspective, from biodiversity, that we've created both sustainable, and by sustainable, potentially actually bringing finance into that through natural capital markets to help stimulate the recovery of our waters as well. And to state the obvious, I'd like to make sure that we're powering ourselves through green energy, which the seabed has a huge potential to do, as well as obviously capturing carbon as well. That's the hat trick. There you go.
Perfect. There you go. Okay, Gus, it has been a pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much for your knowledge and insights.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.